Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Therese Deroe, ERI's Assistant Director for Policy and Implementation. I want to welcome you to today's special conversation covering the ongoing United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP30, which is wrapping up in Belém, Brazil this week. We'll be joined by three IU Bloomington students who've been participating in this year's COP, both in person and virtually, and who are conducting research related to the event. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to let everyone know about some upcoming events that are hosted by ERI. So we are posting links to these events in the chat, but you can also always find our events at eri.iu.edu. So I want to let you know that on Wednesday, December 3rd, our final webinar of the year will offer a close look at the environmental impacts of AI technology. We have a fantastic panel of three Indiana University faculty joining us to discuss this pressing issue for Indiana, so we hope that you can join us. I also want to mention, and we are very excited about the 2026 Indiana Sustainability and Resilience Conference on February 6th here in Bloomington. This conference brings together sustainability-minded Hoosiers from across the state and is always a really fun and energizing day. We are unbelievably fortunate to have Gina McCarthy, the first White House National Climate Advisor and former administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, joining us this year to deliver a keynote talk. Registration is starting to fill up, so don't wait. Click the link that we are sharing in the chat to register. Now I am very excited to introduce our speakers. We are, looks like we're still, I'm gonna introduce all of them. I know, a lot of the students are back in class and schedules have been weird, but we're hoping to be joined by Annabelle Prokopi, an IU Bloomington Wells Scholar studying geography and economics, who attended the first week of COP30. Annabelle's research at COP concerns the intersection of gender negotiations, mineral extraction, and mobility. We'll also be hearing from Sophia Balashivi, a dual degree master's candidate studying public affairs and environmental science with a concentration in energy and climate change solutions. Sophia is a virtual COP30 delegate. Her research focuses on the energy transition in developing countries and transition economies. And finally, we'll be hearing from Marie Renahan, an O'Neill graduate student and ERI's engagement coordinator, who attended the first week of COP30 in Belém. Marie is working towards a master's in environmental sustainability, and her COP30 research examines inclusion of disability in international climate action and negotiations. If you have questions for our speakers, please enter them in the Q&A feature on the bottom toolbar, and we will try to answer as many as we can after our speakers' presentations. So I'm going to turn it over to our speakers. First, Marie is going to give an overview of the COP conference and a brief intro into her work and her research. Then Annabelle is going to share a little bit about her work, and then finally Sophia. Take it away, Marie.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here today. I'm very excited to talk to you all about COP30 after just having been there for a week. But to give a very brief overview of what COP is, since I know not everyone has heard of it, sometimes it's just talked about as a larger thing, but not explained. So COP is the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is a huge mouthful. So it gets shortened down to COP. This is the 30th one, so we are at COP30 this year. And this is all governed by the United Nations. They have a separate section of the UN that covers climate change called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We usually just shorten that to UNFCCC or UNFCCC. So if you hear us say that, we're talking about the governing body that organizes these COP events, that runs all of these climate agreements and helps all of these parties to the climate agreements decide on what they want to include in the documents. So parties are organizations, or usually typically countries or nations that have adopted these climate agreements. And at the COP, all of these parties will share their own representatives from around the world. They will have international climate negotiations. So countries will decide on what they want to include in the text of each document. This is where documents like the Kyoto Protocol and more recently the Paris Agreement were adopted. So these can be very impactful events where global action or inaction on climate change is fundamental to the event and how things proceed during the week. So it's a very exciting time. It's a very hectic time at COP30. There are about 50,000 people in attendance. So we got to experience the first week of that as student delegates, and there are in total 12 student delegates from IU attending this year. The first week we had 5 in person and 1 online, and they'll have another 5 in person and 1 online next, or I guess this week, suppose. Uh, so overall, lots of excitement and fun, but also really important critical climate negotiations for our global future. And then to just give a little bit of an intro about what I was there to research at COP. So I was studying the inclusion of disabilities in climate action, particularly at these COP events and under the governance of the UNFCCC. I was interested in this because disabled people make up about 15% of the global population. So they're a huge portion of our society. However, they are very vulnerable to climate change. They are 4 times more likely to die in climate disasters than non-disabled people. And the UNFCCC has recognized some vulnerable groups like disabled people. They have official constituencies for women, for children, and Indigenous communities that have all had an additional level of support and recognition at these events. And there are 9 total constituencies that have seen a similar level of recognition. However, disabled people and organizations that represent disabled people have not had this level of recognition. So there is an informal caucus of non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that collects a lot of disabled people together and has called for greater involvement and recognition from the UNFCCC to formally create a constituency. So I've been looking into their progress, trying to understand why it's been so difficult in the past and why previous appeals have not been accepted for this recognition. And I've also been looking at accessibility as a baseline. So whether the venue itself at each COP can be accessed by disabled people with different needs, whether online or in-person activities are actually moving things forward for disabled people, and a lot of other just baseline considerations on whether people can get into these events and their voices can be heard to really be involved in climate action on an international scale. All right, so I'd love to throw it over to Annabelle to give her introduction. Annabelle?
Thank you, Marie. Hi, Annabelle.
Hi everyone, my name is Annabelle. I'm a senior. I'm studying geography at IU. I'm currently in Chile. I'm finishing my thesis research, so I won't be able to stay for too long. But at COP, I had a really great opportunity to study the gender negotiations. I was able to work with the past State Department negotiator, head of gender and climate change negotiations for the United States until this year, because obviously they're not present this year. But her name was Leah Newman, and I had the opportunity to kind of follow her whenever there were gender negotiations going on. So I got to know the Gender Action Plan really well, which was very exciting. And to sit in that room with everyone. And then on the side of that, I was looking at more intersections of gender as well as mineral extractivism and mobility. And I identified these as 2 very key topics that people, when you talk to people who are impacted by climate mobility or by extractivism, the links between those implications on gender are very clear, and they're not necessarily very much recognized in the negotiation space. So I was very interested in seeing where those intersections might be lacking or where they might be fulfilled. So I was able to do a lot of interviews with people, a lot of Indigenous women, which was very, really, really wonderful to get to hear their stories about how extractivism has impacted their communities disproportionately, how they as women have been impacted disproportionately, and how pushes for just transitions as well lead to further extractivism on indigenous lands and kind of brought up some challenges with the negotiations that are important, I think, to consider. And then looking at how those come in or don't come into the negotiations. I was also able to spend a lot of time at the Climate Mobility Pavilion and talk with a lot of young youth about their experiences of helping their communities move because of climate implications, which was really, really interesting. I really appreciated the opportunity to get to learn from them. And the ties with gender there were also like quite clear and not really in the negotiations. So yeah, I was mostly following those two sides. It was a really wonderful opportunity to have. I met a lot of people, thought very critically, I think, and was just introduced to a lot of different perspectives.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sophia, would you like to share about your work?
Sure, thank you. So my name is Sofia Balashvili. I'm a graduate student at O'Neill. I study public affairs and environmental science. And this year, as Marie mentioned, we have a little bit of a unique situation. Two of our delegates, my other friend, also an international student, Bashir, and I, had to become virtual delegates due to some strict visa regulations. So my experience is quite different from what Marie, Annabelle, and our other delegates experienced in Belém right now. For me, this opportunity is more so just participating in very particular conferences or meetings that are strictly tied to my research. Unfortunately, I'm not able to see a lot of the fun events and marches, which would be extremely awesome, but I'm glad that our delegates can share that experience with us now when they're back. But to tell a little bit more about my research, so I look at how developing and transition economies can finance and govern their way to energy transition. And it's not just about replacing fossil fuels with renewables, it's more than that. It's about balancing decarbonization with economic growth, energy access, and some institutional change. And due to my background, I focus on two cases. It's Russia and Central Asian republics, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. And so the Paris Agreement and IPCC both stress that meeting global temperature goals requires transforming how we produce and use energy. But in this country, situation is more complicated because they depend on fossil fuels for fiscal stability. Their institutions are pretty rigid, and access to international finance is pretty limited. So, in my research, I try to see and try to argue that progress for these regions depends on three things. It's blended finance to attract investments, it's governance to reform governance reform to build stability, and also a just transition that would make sure that transition is happening in an equitable way. And participating in different COP30 events and also in events of other international institutions like OECD was extremely helpful for me to find some valuable information for my research. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I had two clarifying questions. As you were speaking, I heard terms that I wasn't very familiar with. So I wanted to ask Annabelle, could you define in the context of the COP negotiations the phrase climate mobility?
Yeah, for sure. So climate mobility is like a kind of a paradigm. It's like migration or like non-migration. So in this context, it kind of happens if you live somewhere that's very impacted by climate change. Maybe you live somewhere with rising sea levels, somewhere with severe drought, somewhere with severe floods, but because of climate change and you're forced to move and relocate somewhere else, that would fall under climate mobility. So the context that I was introduced to it at COP was under the Climate Mobility Pavilion, which is run by the Center for Global Climate Mobility, who work very, very closely with communities to build capacities of preparedness.
Mhm.
So kind of trying to think one step ahead of like this community might be at risk of having to relocate because of X climatic reason. So for example, there was youth there from like Tuvalu, from Fiji, from India, from Colombia, and various countries with a lot of risks. and they were building up the capacity from the youth, which I thought was very inspiring, to help them plan ahead for what could potentially result in having to migrate or move due to climate, which is kind of the mobilities. There's also immobilities, which is if you choose to stay despite
Ah,
your somewhere where you live being deemed somewhere that you should probably leave.
mhm.
There's a lot of reasons why you would choose to stay or where you would have to stay, and that's a climate immobility.
That was really helpful because, of course, as a practitioner, I'm thinking uh, transit and electric vehicles. So I'm glad that I could clarify that
Yes.
mobility was about resilience for cultures and communities.
Mhm.
And Sophia, there was also a term that you used that I was hoping that you could clarify. You mentioned transition economies, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about what types of economies or countries those were referring to.
Yes, sure. So transition economies is a term similar to developing countries, actually. It's just a national economy that undergoing a significant shift from uh, to market-based systems. So when I'm speaking about Russia and Central Asian republics, they're also post-Soviet republics with a very central planned economics. And now when they are not part of Soviet Union anymore. They're independent countries, and they're trying to make this transition to market-based economy. That's what we call transition economies, and it usually takes decades to actually become one. So even though Soviet Union collapsed back in the early 90s, we still can give that status to those countries because they're still undergoing reforms.
Okay, so it's not necessarily related to a specific market, but more about developing markets in general.
Right.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really helpful. Well, I have a couple of prepared questions that I think will allow you each to chat about your experience, and then a couple of questions are rolling in from attendees. But I'm interested to hear from each of the three of you. And Annabelle, I respect that you may not be able to stay on the whole hour, so we'll try to front load some questions for you to participate in. My question is, what is the trending topic or theme from the conference that you think will shape climate conversations in the coming year? And I'll start with Marie, please.
Sure, that's a great question. There was definitely a huge focus on adaptation at this conference. So this is something that negotiators have kind of been wrestling with the past few years. There's been a shift from just talking about mitigation, reducing our overall emissions, making sure we're having as least impact on our climate as possible, to really recognizing that we will have a warmer world in our future and we need to start adapting to it while also continuing to mitigate and continuing to decrease our emissions. But adaptation can be very difficult for countries that don't have the capacity in the first place to reduce their emissions. So there's a lot of discussions over financing, technical assistance, tech transfer, other ways of support for those countries. And then it does also connect to disability quite a bit when you talk about adapting communities and remembering that accessibility needs to be at the forefront when these adaptations happen. So if you're helping a community plan for a flood, do you also have measures in place to make sure the disabled members of the community can be evacuated safely? Um, all sorts of different concepts there, but I was trying to keep an eye on adaptation as discussions were continuing, and also the connection between adaptation and health is really interesting. There was a new focus on health at Belém. The Belém Health Action Plan was officially, I think it was officially signed earlier this week, which will be a very exciting new development to kind of connect a missing piece of health to climate action and implementation.
Yeah, that's very interesting because that's a very powerful motivator when some other reasons that we care about climate don't necessarily bring people together the way that health might.
Right.
And that's also interesting that disability is and adaptations for people with disabilities is kind of connected to Annabelle's research topic of that idea of immobility. There are lots of reasons why you wouldn't be able to get out of harm's way. So, Annabelle, I'd love to ask you the same question. What do you think was one of the big topics or themes that will shape climate conversations in the coming year?
Yeah, for sure. I think that just transition was a very major topic this year. Um, we'll see what happens in the next few days, but one of the major goals from the conference was to pass what's called the Belém Action Mechanism, which is trying to create a framework for a just and equitable transition to renewable energies and more sustainable forms of energy. It's very complicated, because this kind of transition has a lot of issues that you don't necessarily think about when you're trying to like install solar panels or switch over to renewable energies if you just are thinking about renewable energies are more sustainable than fossil fuels. But there's a lot of things that go on in the background and in creating those forms of energy that negotiators are trying to create a framework to mitigate a lot of those issues. So some of those might be like extractivism for lithium that is a major mineral in some of these, and it's really damaging to a lot of communities. Or what happens when you switch from fossil fuels and then people don't have a job in a lot of places that rely on exporting these types of materials. So creating this framework, I'm very interested to see how it'll go in the next few days and if it'll get passed and what it looks like. And then I'm also very interested just to see how it goes through the next year, trying to implement that as the conversations continue, because I think that it's very timely as people start to more and more try to have this just transition, making sure that it is like just and equitable for everyone and not just for those who are more privileged.
That's true, and it's helpful to be reminded that our American approach to rolling out clean energy has a lot of ripple effects in other places, and the clean energy deployment is not going to look the same in every part of the world. Sophia, did you notice any themes or trends that you think are going to be an important part of conversations to come?
Sure. So first of all, I agree with both Marie and Annabelle what they mentioned, especially Annabelle mentioned just transition. It's exactly a part of my topic. So I also think it's one of the most important topics during this COP. I would also mention that the focus on climate finance and the Baku to Belém roadmap would be very important, like is a very important and trending issue right now, because developing countries and transition economies, they need huge amounts of funding, and we're talking trillions of dollars. And COP30 finally treated this as a real problem, and that is not something secondary. And hearing about like needed reforms for development banks, making loans cheaper, combining public and private finance, and all other topics connected to that. I think it's extremely important because we need to, as Marie mentioned, we need to go from words to actually doing some like action in order to tackle climate change, right? So, and when I'm talking about finance, just like as an example, like for example, a solar project that costs 3% interest in Europe can be as high as like 12% in Central Asia. And for developing countries, it's really hard to create that platform for energy transition if they don't have access to finance. And even if they do, it has like high interest rates. So for me, I really like look closely into those topics. And I think it's very important that they're being discussed this year.
That's great. Those are three major themes to keep an eye on: just transition, health, and climate finance. Many members of the audience are very curious to know how your experience was impacted by the decision of the United States not to send any delegation. I know
Um,
Annabelle mentioned a little bit of that in her comments. How did that affect your
yeah,
experience, Annabelle?
yeah, I can definitely talk about that. I think it was really, really interesting, especially because I had the opportunity to work with the past gender and climate negotiator from the United States. So I got to kind of see it from her perspective. So like the first day that we met, she's now training other negotiators. So she's kind of switched to the role of like observer, but like training negotiators from, she's mostly working with negotiators from dryland regions. So it's really interesting, and she's found other ways to navigate it. But it was very clear from like right when we got there that it was a shakeup, and she didn't really know how to navigate the space in this way. And just thinking about how like normally she would have been at the negotiating table, and now she's an observer trying to just help other negotiators was just like it was such a contrast, and it just made me think about how, I mean, there's no negotiators from the US in any of these rooms now, and on all these major topics that we just talked about. And I do think it's really impactful. I think people were very upset. You heard it sometimes, like people saying like, oh, and the US isn't even in the room for these conversations, and they're the ones contributing, like almost probably like very, very high up in contributors to climate change, and
Right.
to just not even be in the room was just like was very, people were very upset about it. And I think um it makes people feel less like they want to do their part if such a major contributor doesn't even want to show up to the table. That was kind of my perspective from seeing it. But people are still doing things, like for example, there was a panel with Gavin Newsom was there. There was a panel about how the US is still in. It was like America is all in. They had a few different major mayors and people from the United States come and talk about more like it really switched like city and state-led climate stuff, which really ties back to ERI also. It was like the role of cities is going to become more and more important. Um, and that has become, I think, the focus of people that were there on behalf of the United States.
Yes, I'm glad to hear people are still really enthusiastic about local action and the impacts that can make. Marie, what did you notice?
Sure, I have to echo a lot of what Annabelle said. There was definitely a bit of surprise when I introduced myself to new people that, oh, you're from the US. There are still people from the US at this event. But also, most people were very welcoming of the fact that we were there. They were supportive that anyone from our nation was representing. I think there was a distinct lack of US involvement compared to previous years. There's an informal group called Fossil of the Day that awards a nation with it's the award for being the best at being the worst. So they pick one nation or party each day. Earlier in the week, they started with the Ray of the Day and actually gave a positive award to the group of 77 in China, which is a group of developing nations that are doing a huge amount of work to try to speed up our timeline, increase adaptation, increase financing, a lot of different components. But at the end of the week on Friday, unfortunately, the US got the Fossil of the Day award, and they had someone representing the United States kind of in a comically, a funny manner, grab the award and accept it on our behalf. But honestly, just seeing the audience's reaction, it wasn't a surprise to any of us that this was given to the US. It's very clear, I think, globally that the US has taken a shift in our involvement in global climate action. And I think having anyone there at all who's from a university, a small organization, a small community representing was a delight compared to having just no government involvement whatsoever.
Mhm.
I just want to mention, as someone who's not from the US and from a very different country with a very different political regime, I think it's beautiful to see that there's not only federal government that can decide what to do, but state governments and local governments and NGOs and student delegations have enough autonomy to go and represent the country and actually come back and make a change within the country, even if the federal government does not agree with this. I think it's just amazing to see that. So yeah, that's just a small comment from me.
Oh, that's a really interesting observation, Sophia. Thank you. I do. I'll ask Annabelle a question. Annabelle, what was the most surprising thing about your in-person COP experience?
Um, that's a really good question. I think I didn't really know what to expect, I guess, going into it. I tried to like keep it pretty open to like how it was just gonna shake out. I think there were a couple of things that were surprising. Maybe just the number of people there. I think that I didn't really realize. I mean, I knew there's gonna be a lot of people, but when you're there, there's so many people, and it was just really inspiring, I think, to be able to be around so many people who just like you would just ask them like, oh, like what do you study? What do you work on? And it was just always something really, really interesting that you hadn't thought about before. Um, and I think that's a space that I was very grateful to be in, and I haven't really been able to be in that capacity before. So in that way, that was like a good surprise. I think something that wasn't necessarily surprising, but I did know, was the kind of the contrast at the COP. So there was a lot of like presence of like indigenous communities like protesting outside of the venue, saying that like the COP isn't necessarily like speaking for them and what they might need and what is impacting them very negatively. And I think being able to see that in person and then see the contrast of like there was one day we got there and we were had to wait a little bit longer to get inside and go through a different line because there was like a very large indigenous presence protesting outside of the venue. Um, and people just had to go in another line, but then you get inside the venue and you're in this like just this other place that's like where you it was just such a contrast and I felt very, very kind of weird about it. And like it was very important and I'm very like grateful to have had those experiences to get to hear from these indigenous people that were coming. And I think that wasn't necessarily surprising. I didn't fully expect that, but being able to see it, I was very grateful for and very grateful for their presence. But that contrast maybe was more surprising.
Yeah. I don't think you can do climate work without learning to hold that discomforting kind of
Yeah.
dissonance in your head, but it's pretty intense to see it right in front of you like that. Well, I guess a flip question for Sophia as a virtual participant. I kind of imagine just an endless Zoom call, but I'm wondering if there were any unexpected ways that virtual delegates were able to engage or learn or experience the conference that you were able to tap into.
Sure. So honestly, it is more dynamic than I expected. The COP30 platform works pretty well, and they have a lot of recorded sessions that I can just revisit after my classes, and all the assignments that I need to do. So I usually my COP30 happens in the evenings when I have free time to rewatch what happened. Unfortunately, a lot of side events are not available, and those are the exactly like most of the events that I wanted to participate in are the side events, so very focused, like topic related discussions, which are usually like not major big events. It's just maybe like 20 people in the room, like talking and listening to four speakers talking. Um, but still, there's a lot of opportunities um, to go through like thematic hubs, expert interviews, some regional side events, and then I also mentioned that some other international organizations have, in parallel, have their own events that are related to the themes of COP30. So there's a lot of content to consume and to see. Of course, I'm not gonna lie, like it's hard to, as part of the class going to COP as delegates, we need to do interviews with negotiators, people from different countries, like representatives from different countries and organizations to submit our final project. So for me and our other virtual delegate, that is not a requirement anymore because it's just extremely hard to find anyone who would be willing to speak with you during the COP events because it's just so intense and a lot of things are going on right there, right now. But still, participating in the conference is an opportunity, and I feel like I do like this experience still is great. Like even though I am not in Brazil and so I'm not able to be on the ground and talk to some people. So yeah,
Yeah.
and as Professor Riley told us, it might be happening more often from now on. Now when the U.S. is not participating in COP, so hopefully not. Hopefully our delegates will still be able to go and be there physically. But who knows? It's always good to explore this virtual opportunity as well.
Yeah, that's really great. I was not even aware that there was a virtual participation option, but I'm sure
Yeah,
it
yeah,
moves
and
around the world and people are coming from all over, so it's expensive
right.
and
And also,
difficult
like,
to
if we're
travel.
talking about climate change, sometimes maybe it's good to stay virtual and not to contribute to global emissions, you know.
Yeah.
Here, we still get our badges as virtual delegates, and we have this like exclusive access that only delegates can have.
Oh,
So we
okay.
do have access to a lot of the events that are happening right now at COP.
Yeah. Well, we're also disappointed about the way that your experience was impacted, and we regret that. But I'm so glad that you were able to make the most of it and still participate in the virtual platform.
Thank you.
Marie, a question for you. I'm actually really curious if you had a chance to check out any pavilions and if you'd be able to explain to our audience what that was and how it related to the negotiations that were at the center of the conference.
Definitely. Yeah. And actually, if I could just jump off of Sophia's point for a second, there was kind of an interest in person as well for whether we could do some hybrid remote and in-person events, and whether
Mhm.
delegates who weren't able to attend with visa issues like Sophia, or we had many events that I attended that speakers just had flight issues. There were delays, there were cancellations, so they couldn't
Oh,
get there in time. And there was definitely an interest from a lot of people to shift to sort of a hybrid format and allow more online involvement. So I'm very curious to see if that will continue or increase in the future, especially like Sophia said, considering the emissions of traveling. It can't be a replacement for a lot of the in-person negotiations, but I think it would be amazing if a lot more pavilions jumped on the bandwagon and had an online version. But to give a little clarity on pavilions, so these are individual areas where each country, or sometimes it's an NGO or nonprofit, they will have their own small meeting room, or sort of like an exhibit at a museum. A lot of different formats for these rooms, but typically they'll have a seating area, maybe with 10 to 20 seats, and a space where people can present and you can go to a topic centered conversation. So something very clearly related to your topic. I went to many, many different pavilions, partly because my topic is not currently something that's highlighted in formal negotiations, because the Disability Caucus is still informal and not an official constituency. They don't really have a place in negotiations. So instead, I attended a lot of health related conversations, a lot of events that centered on disability or talked about disability, at least in some aspect. So I was frequently at the World Health Organization's Health Pavilion. They talked a lot about disaster resilience and health impacts, chronic health issues, disabilities. And then, surprisingly for me initially, but it made more sense later on, the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion actually had a lot of disability related events. Initially, I thought this was just a fantastic thing that they were working very intersectionally, trying to get more voices involved. But I realized that there's actually a huge push for disabled involvement from a group of women. There's a large group of women from Nepal, actually, the Nepal Indigenous Disabled Women's Association. And they recognize their identity as Indigenous disabled women as a combination, not as something you can separate out. So they had a huge hand in creating a lot of these events and pushing for greater recognition for the past 10 years or more. So I followed their work quite a bit. And honestly, I like to hop around from country to country and just see what they were doing and whether their work related to anything I was interested in researching. And then also, of course, because I'm involved with ERI, I tried to see some higher ed activities. The Higher Education Pavilion had a great array of universities and students talking about their work and how we can do community-centered research and partnerships with local universities and try to get more climate action from the higher ed perspective. So it was really a tremendous experience to just go from these different pavilions and see what's happening across the globe that I wouldn't necessarily be aware of just from my own little perspective in Indiana. And I really appreciated how widely diverse and just wide reaching these pavilions were. You could literally walk from Ethiopia to France in 2 minutes. So it was a very cool interconnected space.
What a great experience. So we're nearing the end of our time, and I've got one more question. Thank you, Annabelle. So last chance for our attendees to put questions in the Q&A box. Thank you for those that did. We were happy to be able to answer them live. Well, I guess my second to last question is, do we know where COP31 will be held? Not in the US, I'm guessing.
We do not. So this is actually still a point of conflict. Australia and Turkey have both put in bids and they are kind of in a stalemate. They have been talking about this for months and really trying to get someone to commit to it. They're both willing to commit, but neither will let the other one do it, essentially. They actually did announce that COP32 will be in Ethiopia next year. So we already, or sorry, in 2 years from now, in 2027. So we do know where that will be held, but we don't quite know next year. Um, from my understanding, this is kind of uncommon. Typically, by the start of one COP, you'll know the plan for the next year. So it's something they're still talking about. And interestingly, the Turkey and Australia pavilions are right next to each other in the COP space. So I think attendees are also kind of curious about this dynamic and who's going to win out.
That is very interesting. I think climate change is not going to be solved in the next 2 years, so it seems like there would be opportunities for many countries to continue to host the conference. So my final question for each of you, and I'll start with Sophia and then let Marie answer, is thinking about your conference experience and the sessions and presentations you were able to attend, what left each of you feeling hopeful?
Um, so for me, I guess it's always inspiring to hear from representatives from companies, from NGOs in developing countries and transition economies, just hearing different case studies on, I don't know, mini grid development in African countries or some other achievements made on local level, like by communities. Um, those are the things that makes you think that the change is happening. And it's even though COP30 is a place where all the countries and all this like high level people are meeting to negotiate something, to discuss things and everything, doesn't matter if the consensus will be reached or not, there will be change happening on local levels because communities are worried about climate change because we feel like how we're being affected and we want to change the status quo. So for me, that is probably the most inspiring thing.
Yes, those really tangible examples of things that are already happening.
Yeah.
That's great. Marie, what left you feeling hopeful?
Yeah, so many things. I think just being in a space where everyone wants good for our climate is not something that happens a lot in the US, especially not with 50,000 people all together. So that was incredibly inspiring. Hearing people's perspectives on their previous COP experiences and how it has changed to this one. I think even just in the first couple of days of the conference, while some pavilions were still finishing building their little mini buildings and trying to get organized, there was still a kind of a buzz of energy, a willingness to have these conversations, start planning, start figuring out how we can act quicker and more effectively, and a willingness to collaborate that I love. I thrive on collaboration. So I was so happy to hear that it's not a place of anger and conflict between countries or a place where even like NGOs have to fight between each other to get financing, but they're trying to support each other and support our global effort to stay cool and reduce our emissions. And I was really, really inspired as a student as well to see what my future impact could be or what our global impact could be if we work together.
Thank you for that. Well, we'll wrap up our conversation today. I'm sure everyone is exhausted and has a lot to catch up on. after a busy week. So thank you both for joining us, and for Annabelle, who has to finish her research and her journey back from South America. All right. Thank you so much, friends, for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.